Dave, it's great to have you on. Welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here. I really appreciate you having me.
So, Dave, there is a new law that is making a lot of headlines in California about the housing and CEQA environmental reform. Can you tell us what's going on?
Yes. So California's Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, has been reformed in a massively significant and really transformative way as of Monday evening, Tuesday morning. CEQA, which has been on the books for many years, it was enacted in 1970 when Ronald Reagan was governor, was originally a very simple and straightforward set of requirements. Projects, development projects, be them housing or office or whatever, had to disclose to the public the environmental effects of the development. Over 50 plus years, this statute has turned into a complete beast, and many court decisions have made it incredibly complicated, layered on requirement after requirement, to the point now where we have CEQA documents for fairly benign and straightforward projects that are thousands of pages long. And the legislature and the governor this week finally said enough is enough. Our state housing problems are so significant and acute. Our greenhouse gas emission goals and ambitions are so significant that we need to do something different to streamline and expedite and unlock the development potential for housing projects, which are desperately needed in infill areas where we know it is good for the environment to build those types of housing projects. I have been working with CEQA for 20 years, virtually most of my professional career. And it has been a version of banging my head against the wall, the CEQA wall, on behalf of projects, frustrated by its many requirements and really its overall dysfunction. The other day, that wall broke down, and clients are calling me left and right. My phone is ringing off the hook. People are wanting to know, who I've worked with, maybe not for a long time, but calling me out of the blue saying, I want to maybe get back in the game. How does this new law help my project? How will housing move faster and be less expensive and be less risky for me to invest in a piece of property to build housing on a going forward basis? And I used to joke that as a land use lawyer, I oftentimes did not bring good news to a telephone conversation with a developer or a Zoom meeting. But the last couple of days, I've been all cheer. I've had nothing but good things to say, because things are things are looking upbeat, and this is a very significant and big deal reform. Very welcome news, overdue, but significant nonetheless. And I think it's going to have a massively positive impact on the development that we all know we need, housing in the infill areas.
So, how much is this going to lead to a lot more development in the areas where they're infill, like in the cities? And can you explain infill as well?
Yes. So infill is fairly broadly defined in the statute. We're talking about sites that are under 20 acres that are in cities and are surrounded by what the statute describes as urban uses. So commercial, residential, parks, schools, built out areas. What we're not talking about is urban, suburban sprawl, building housing and new sprawl development into agricultural land, for example. That could not use this exemption. Those projects would still have to go through rigorous environmental review. But we're talking mainly about areas and cities in and around jobs and transit that are already built out, and that our state's climate requirements and goals very much encourage development in housing, because housing in those locations brings down the number of vehicular trips, reduces greenhouse gas emissions, and oh, by the way, happens to house people, which is critically needed in today's California, where the housing production supply has been very underwhelming for many, many years and has resulted in a very steep affordability crisis that we're now grappling with.
So, can you explain to us what kind of lawsuits were coming through CEQA?
Sure. So different interest groups with different vested interests were fairly regularly challenging projects under CEQA, and oftentimes housing projects. And that could come from different sources. Sometimes it's people and communities that are reacting viscerally to change. A building that's coming into your neighborhood that you may think is too tall, that you may think produces traffic and could change the character of your neighborhood. Well, that happens to be a wealthy neighborhood and people are well-heeled and have access to lawyers. We were seeing housing projects like that get challenged by homeowner association groups and local community-based organizations. Organized labor is a constituency group that frequently challenges housing projects and brings CEQA lawsuits to leverage labor commitments out of developers. Not because they don't want to see the development happen, they do. That means jobs, it's needed for them. But they bring CEQA lawsuits not for really environmental benefit, but really to try to secure, in their view, better labor protections. Sometimes, I have a project like this that I'm working on, that there's just anti-competitive sort of underpinnings or business disputes between a landlord, say, and a developer next door that results in a CEQA lawsuit. So what we saw over and over again is this, again, statute from 1970 that was supposed to be about protecting the environment and disclosing to the public environmental impacts being used as a weapon by people who had ulterior motives and just didn't want to see the development happening. And that went on for a very long time. And the other day, the governor and the legislature just said enough is enough. The state has gotten to a point where we have got to build new housing. We have got to build it faster. We have got to build it in places like the infill context where the exemption focuses on. And that led to this unbelievably significant and landmark reform that I have to admit, I did not believe I would see in my professional lifetime.
But we have heard that you have to use unions, labor contracts to be able to do these projects using this new law. Is that true?
That is not true, or not, I should say, not entirely true. We thought that was going to be true. Historically, over the last few years, major land use reforms and CEQA reforms and land use streamlining tools have all come with the mandatory labor provisions that you just described. And the outcome, the results of that has been those tools have not been used very often, and they have not resulted in the production of very many housing units at all. And so we were very concerned, those of us who were monitoring the progress of this particular exemption and this package of CEQA reforms that were adopted yesterday, we were very concerned that they were going to be saddled with the same labor requirements that made prior tools unworkable and unfeasible and unusable. And probably the most significant outcome yesterday is that for the vast majority of housing projects, there are no mandatory labor, what we call prevailing wage, high-level wage requirements that make it very challenging and to build feasible projects. Those were left out of the exemption. Only certain projects, high-rise projects, which are really defined in the law as above 85 feet, so you're really talking about a 9-story building or taller, those have mandatory labor provisions, prevailing wage and union obligations. And that's for a good reason, because that type of construction, which is more involved, more complex, more expensive, typically gets built with union labor anyways, mostly, not entirely, but oftentimes. So those projects are more able economically to sustain those higher labor requirements than smaller projects, more mid-rise and low-rise projects that are built primarily out of wood that really don't work economically with those kind of labor requirements. So most of the projects we see in Los Angeles and throughout the Southland are those mid-rise projects, are 8 stories or lower, and those projects will be able to use this exemption to streamline their process, expedite the review and approval of that housing project without those labor requirements that in previous iterations of CEQA reform made the benefit unusable and unworkable.
For some people that are concerned that this is going to damage the environment and cause a bunch of high-rises to show up in their community or bypass the rules, what are your thoughts on that?
I don't buy it. I don't buy it at all. In fact, I categorically reject it because, again, this bill is fairly narrowly tailored to a specific type of housing project in the infill context, in the infill environment. And those projects, we know two things right now in California. We know we need more housing. No one argues with that. Even people who are professional opponents of housing won't say out loud that we don't need housing. That is now, it is a truism that no one rejects. We need more housing. Okay, if you accept that, and virtually everybody does, we also know that we have very ambitious climate requirements in California. We pride ourselves on being a pro-environment state, some of the most extensive and rigorous greenhouse gas reduction requirements and mandates of any state anywhere. And that's for very good and intentional reasons. Well, what does housing projects in the infill environment do? It produces needed housing, and it reduces greenhouse gas emissions and produces a positive environmental outcome. So for those people who are saying you have just thrown out California's environmental protections, I think that is a complete and utter misreading of the law. What we have done here is made absolutely needed housing easier to build, at the same time advancing, not derailing our environmental goals. Those are two big policy wins that should be celebrated.
Now, what about the cost of housing? So you have seen what's going on the ground. How much of these lawsuits go into the cost of housing, and will this lower the cost of housing?
So the CEQA process, because it can be so protracted and expensive, even if there is no lawsuit, slows down and makes housing more expensive, one. If there is a CEQA lawsuit, it really slows down and adds expense and potentially kills the project entirely. Not because a lot of these CEQA lawsuits have a ton of merit to them, but because by the time the developer gets all the way through the slog of the city or county process and then faces years in court on a lawsuit, at a certain point, you can't finance the project. You can't continue to go forward. The economics fall apart for you. And so CEQA opponents, sort of nefariously oftentimes employ the strategy that I call win by losing. File what is a losing lawsuit on the merits, but win the real outcome, which is to kill the project due to time and expense. And what the exemption did the other day is make it exceedingly harder for people with that objective to be successful, to employ the CEQA statute in that way to stop slow housing just to maintain the status quo. And so I think in that sense, it will bring down the cost of housing. It will allow housing to be built faster and cheaper. Will this be a total panacea to all of our problems in this state having to do with housing affordability? Will the C part, today and ongoing no, it's not going to. I wish it was, but it's not going to. We still have high construction costs, high interest rates, precarious economic uncertainty with tariffs coming from the White House. There are a lot of challenges. In Los Angeles, we have a special tax called Measure ULA that your program has done extensive and excellent work reporting on, that makes it very hard to build. So there are still other challenges, both macroeconomic and microeconomic, and my hope is that those will move in positive directions for other reasons. But yesterday, government did, at least the state government did, about as much as I ever thought could be possible in terms of making it easier and producing a better regulatory environment for these projects. And even though we have other challenges, that is still a very big deal.
If you like California Insider and the topics and the interviews we conduct, chances are you really like the Epoch Times newspaper. We are part of the editorial team of Epoch Times. This is not just a newspaper, it's a news platform with hundreds of articles a day. We interview different sides of stories on different topics. We cover state-level issues to national to international. We have a unique coverage on China as well, and a lot of other topics that the mainstream media may not cover. We have a story in this week's edition about the tariffs and their impacts on the activity at the ports. Shippings and truckers are really feeling the impact of the tariffs at the ports. And our reporters are giving you a perspective on the ground of what's happening. Make sure to check out the newspaper. We have a special deal for you where you can get the digital or the print for $1 a week for the first month. Now let's go back to the interview. Now, Dave, can you give us some examples? You might have seen these type of CEQA lawsuits that come along. Can you give us examples of these projects that you've seen shut down or got significantly delayed that you think they will not be delayed anymore?
Sure, I'll give you an example. We have many of them. I could bend your ear all day and night. I won't, I promise. There's a project in Studio City that we worked on, and it's a beautiful project. It's a housing project, one of the most attractive, aesthetically speaking, projects that I worked on in my career. It also happened to produce 53 very low-income units, unsubsidized, not $1 of government subsidy, that would have been produced in one of the highest resource, most expensive neighborhoods in the city of Los Angeles for low-income people to enjoy what will be an unbelievable community and surrounding environment. It was, in my view, the archetype of an ideal project: the right location, the right design, the right mix of affordability and marketability. It had ground floor commercial spaces that was going to activate a critical segment of Ventura Boulevard, very important commercial corridor in the valley. This thing checked all the boxes. For the last few years, it has been mired in CEQA reform from a lawsuit from a neighboring business that was filing the lawsuit not over anything having to do with the environment, but over issues related to landlord-tenant disputes and other business factors. And a NIMBY group, a neighborhood homeowner association group that thought it would produce too much traffic. Years lost on what could have been a phenomenal project and improvement to the area and housed over 500 people, including 50 very low-income families that can't otherwise afford to live in that particular neighborhood. If this CEQA bill had been an option for us at the time that we went through the approval process, we would have gotten the approval much faster. Not to say that someone still couldn't have sued, maybe they still would have sued, but the lawsuit would have been far more narrow. There would have been very few things for them to actually challenge, almost to the point where they may have found it to be pointless, at least if they were looking at it pragmatically. So that is a clear-cut example of how CEQA has slowed progress in our communities throughout our state, very much so in Los Angeles, particularly in wealthier areas where these CEQA lawsuits are more prevalent. But what's more insidious is not that specific actual project that I cited that has been delayed significantly as a result of CEQA lawsuits, but rather all of the great projects that never went forward at all because the developer and their investors knew that if they proposed that project in that location with that neighborhood history, that they likely could have been sued and therefore made a business decision to take a pass and do a project somewhere else. That's the hidden problem with CEQA. People cite to numbers saying, well, if you look at the number of actual lawsuits, there really aren't that many. Well, that's because the hidden statistic of all the projects that never got off the ground, you can't quantify that. But it's very real, and I know it's very real because I have those conversations with the people who build these projects or choose not to build them every single day of the week. So I am really emboldened and excited by this reform. I think it's incredibly consequential. And I know my clients who build housing units all over the state feel the same because they won't stop calling me since this bill became law. They're all trying to figure out how to use it and how to get their projects done faster and less expensive.
Now, Dave, you mentioned clients are calling you. So for our audience that are looking at the housing situation in California, and it's very hard to afford housing now, especially younger people, how long does it take for average Californians to feel the effect of a law like this?
So it's definitely a few years of implementation, for sure. In the macro sense, in terms of when we can really start to point to housing starts, new construction starts, and to tie that back directly to the benefits of the exemption. But we're already starting to feel the practical effects of this. I mean, we have projects right now that are forced to be on a very long approval track through CEQA that are now pivoting to this much faster, more expedited route. And so I think we will see projects be approved in the very near term much faster with this new law being put in place. One of the exciting things about the way this was done is the governor was very bold and the legislature was very bold and decided not to make this change through normal legislation, but rather to put it in the budget, which means it takes effect immediately. So the law passed, Monday. Tuesday, CEQA was, entirely different. Had it been run through normal legislation, we wouldn't have had the opportunity to use this until January 1st of next year. In the next 6 months, we're going to make a lot of headway on a lot of projects, moving things faster because this tool is now in place immediately.
You mentioned that this went into the budget, and is there any other things that happen in this process?
Yes, there are. The CEQA exemption that we've been spending our time discussing is the crown jewel of the Housing Trailer Budget Act for sure, but there are other significant changes and benefits that will expedite the approval of housing projects. Changes to what we call the Permit Streamlining Act, which is the main state law that governs timeframes and processes around applications for housing. That statute has had a myriad of loopholes in it. This new law closes some of those loopholes and makes the timeframes under which cities need to process and approve these projects tighter. That's very significant. In addition to the exemption, there are additional CEQA reforms that were added to the budget that will very much help projects that fail to meet the exemption criteria. Not every project, as I mentioned earlier, is going to be benefited by the exemption. Infill projects that don't have certain environmental limitations, those will be able to use it. But there are projects that will be excluded for one or more reasons. But there are other CEQA streamlining tools that were put in the bill that will help those projects maybe do some more analysis than would have been required through the exemption, but still go much faster than they would have before the budget trailer bill was enacted. So we got a hodgepodge of new great tools to work with. It's Christmas and Hanukkah wrapped up all in one for land use lawyers because we now can give our clients a better fighting chance to get through the process better and have more opportunities to basically tell cities and counties that may not be moving as fast or in the way that we would like them to do it, that there are new laws that require these things to go on a more expedited basis than previously occurred, that previously were allowed to go.
So how long have you been working with CEQA?
Going back a very long time. In fact, much earlier than my professional career as a land use attorney. I first learned the term CEQA when I was 20 years old. I was a college student at the University of California, Davis. I happened to be student body president at the time. And naively, as you are when you're 20, I ran on a platform of bringing down the rents, as if I had any control over that whatsoever, because my fellow students were telling me that it was getting so expensive to live in the city of Davis. City of Davis is an amazing college town. The entire town kind of revolves around the university, but yet the town wasn't building any housing. And literally, my fellow students were being pushed out of the town into neighboring areas, Sacramento and Woodland and other communities. And I literally saw sort of before me Davis losing its best quality, it being a college town and a welcoming, hospitable place for the student population. So when I realized I couldn't obviously do anything about that as student body president, I decided to run for city council. And I ran for city council in Davis, which was a very NIMBY kind of parochial place in 1998. And I ran on a pro-development platform, a development of building more housing. And I remember when I announced, the local reporter did a write-up on it, and he said, this guy, Dave Rand, student running for city council, encouraging development. He'll be lucky to get 2 votes if his mother moves to town. And he was basically right. I didn't get many votes. It was not a popular campaign message. But that was 1998. There was no such term as YIMBY. That was way, way, way before that activism and movement was begun. But even then, people like me were seeing the deleterious effects of not building new housing and what that meant to communities. Well, flash forward today, I'm a land use attorney. It's 2025. I've spent 20 years working on CEQA, banging my head against the wall, trying to get through the process and deal with all its dysfunction. And I thought about that the other day, my original start and maiden voyage with CEQA back as a 20-year-old, because I think finally, for the first time, the legislature and the governor of the state have really figured it out, or at least a big part of it, to unleash us, unlock us from this constraint that was having such a negative effect, I think, on affordability in the state and the state meeting its very significant policy goals. And all this time later, I think we may now be moving in a much more positive direction. So I'm very hopeful, far more so than I was at 20 or even 40 today.
Dave Rand, California land use attorney. It was great to have you on California Insider.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you having me. It was a lot of fun.